Good morning. Thank you all for coming out this morning. It's my pleasure today to introduce this briefing on New World Vistas. Over the past period of time, there's been a number of distinguished people looking at the Air Force of the future and better ways of doing business in the Air Force. And today we're going to release that report to you, and we're very appreciative today to have the Secretary of the Air Force, Dr. Widnall, here to make some remarks. We have our Vice Chief of Staff, General Tom Moorman, who will be here representing the Chief of Staff. This has been a co-venture between the Secretary and the Chief's Office, and Dr. Gene McCall, who is the Chairman of the Scientific Advisory Board. So the rules here today will be, I'll invite Dr. Widnall to come up and say a few remarks, and then we'll have Dr. McCall, and then we'll show a short video, and then take some of your questions and answers. So if I could introduce Dr. Widnall.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming today for the public release of the long-awaited New World Vistas summary report. I know that both General Fogelman and I have been looking forward to this moment with great anticipation. My anticipation was fueled by the knowledge that the New World Vistas study may not only set the pace for our science and technology investments for the near future, but it may also predict the kinds of weapon systems available for the warfighters a decade from now. I'd also like to thank Dr. Gene McCall, Chairman of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, for his superb leadership of the New World Vista study. With my MIT experience, I definitely know the challenges associated with trying to lead 50 highly intelligent, energetic scientists and engineers to help them reach a consensus and publish a report by the deadline. It was a little over a year ago that I challenged Dr. McCall to search for the most advanced air and space ideas, project them into the future, and describe how this would change the Air Force. Clearly a tall order. Given the blistering pace of technology, predicting beyond the next week is often tough enough. In addition to asking Gene and the SAB where we should spend our scarce research and development dollars, I asked him to identify areas where we could minimize Air Force investment, where we could rely on the commercial world for our technology needs. The Air Force SAB, which I might add includes some of our nation's top scientists and engineers, worked hard last year on New World Vistas. They delivered a summary of their report to General Fogelman and me on December 15th, 1995. I call your attention to this date because it holds tremendous historical significance for the Air Force. For it was exactly 50 years ago, December 15th, 1945, that Dr. Theodor von Karman delivered a similar technological forecast to General Hap Arnold. This seminal report, entitled Toward New Horizons, propelled the Air Force into the high-tech service that it is today. Try to imagine the technological mindset back in the closing days of World War II, a war fought with propeller-driven fighters, massive bomber sorties, and machine guns. And yet, 50 years ago, von Karman and the original Air Force SAB predicted that the future Air Force would include supersonic aircraft, pilotless aircraft, GPS, rapid aerial transportation of entire armies, precision-guided munitions, weather satellites. Now, if I were to list the key elements in our victory during Desert Storm, I think I'd come up with this very same list. It is still hard for me to imagine that level of insight into the future. However, it goes to show the technological forecast shaped the Air Force R&D investment and ultimately the weapon systems we use today. And now, 50 years later, I'm confident that our new forecast, New World Vistas, will have the same effect on our near-term R&D investment in our future weapon systems. For this reason, I suppose it's no surprise that General Fogelman and I have attached a great deal of importance to this effort. In New World Vistas, the Scientific Advisory Board predicts a future Air Force, which includes directed energy weapons like airborne lasers and high-powered microwaves, carrying out multiple missions, increased uses for UAVs, including combat missions, every airplane carrying a digital map of the world with 1 meter resolution, GPS with 1 centimeter accuracy, extensive integration of military and commercial space efforts, using our precision-guided munitions expertise to deliver supplies right to their point of use, continuous worldwide hyperspectral observations with 5 to 10 meter accuracy using small distributed satellites. And let me assure you that this study is not going to sit on the shelf and gather dust. We have already set aside funding for some of these promising new areas of research, and our long-range planner, Major General Gordon, will integrate New World Vistas into the mainstream of Air Force planning to ensure we are on a path towards the weapons of the future. And in fact, this fall, General Fogelman and I will meet with Air Force senior leadership at a Corona conference dedicated to long-range planning. With that, let me introduce the man that made the New World Vistas into an effort in the same league with von Karman's Towards New Horizons. Dr. Gene McCall, Chairman of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board. Gene?
Thank you, Dr. Widnall. We've been engaged in this activity for a year, as Dr. Widnall said, and although she referred to the effort involved in doing a study of this sort, let me assure you that everyone had a wonderful time. That what we do is we investigate new technologies and we try to invent them. And in doing that, we sort of satisfy our basic urges as scientists and engineers. Well, 50 years ago, the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board delivered its first report, Toward New Horizons. And World War II had shown the power of science and technology used in war, but there was still uncertainty about the path to the future of the Air Force. The Scientific Advisory Board defined the path. The recommendations of New World Vistas were followed by the Air Force, and the world's most powerful and effective aerospace force emerged. Today, the end of the Cold War has produced uncertainties that are similar to those we experienced at the end of World War II. We no longer have a single, well-known enemy. The precise scenarios of deterrence are no longer relevant. And we must develop generic capabilities to deal with many poorly defined threats. The commercial world has taken the lead in the development of militarily significant technologies, such as information and space. And affordability has become a primary consideration in weapon development programs. The Secretary of the Air Force, Dr. Sheila Widnall, and the Chief of Staff, General Ronald Fogelman, recognized the need to understand the effects on the Air Force of the rapid changes in technology. So they directed the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board to identify technologies which will greatly enhance the Air Force of the future and to suggest ways of using emerging commercial technologies in Air Force systems. Dr. Widnall named the study New World Vistas. The SAB has attempted to take a new view of the world as it is defined by developing technologies. Now, we believe that we've satisfied Dr. Widnall's and General Fogelman's directives. But of course, our view of the world's political future is no better than anyone else's. We have, however, attempted to define some possibilities based on technologies. And we have defined a path to the future which begins today. New World Vistas is the technological complement of the mission-oriented core competencies of the Air Force. And together, they form the basis of the Air Force doctrine of global reach, global power. Now, I'll describe some of the major features of the New World Vistas and their effect on the Air Force, but let me just point out that the entire report is in 15 volumes, approximately 2,000 pages. You've been given Volume 1, the summary volume. It's only 96 pages. We've spared you the rest, and it even has pictures. So I hope you'll find it interesting, informative, and easy to read. It was written to give you an impression of the output of the study, and certainly Chapter 1 is to allow you to formulate a feeling rather than to extract the details. The following chapters lay out some of the details and attempt to identify the important technologies. Now, the chairs of the 12 panels who ran the study are here. They're available for questions. You can ask them things in any detail you like. They can probably answer them a lot better than I can. Okay. Now, throughout the report, you'll find many technologies and their uses described. Shown a few here. We believe the technologies will produce striking increases in the effectiveness of the Air Force. You should keep in mind that there's a unifying thread which runs through the entire report, and that is that increased tempo of operations produces increased effectiveness of operations. Now, a major factor in producing increased tempo is the integration of new technologies, many systems, many technologies, many people, many approaches, as shown here, into a single operational system. And it's mainly the information, the communication, the space technologies of the 21st century that will make integration possible. Systems which stand alone, as do many current systems, can no longer be tolerated. Standalone systems will evolve from being only ineffective to being dangerous to our own forces. Now, I'll leave the detailed understanding of the philosophy we use to evaluate our technologies and to generate these 6 major capabilities I showed you earlier as an exercise for those who actually read the summary volume. And in the short time here, I'll describe a few of the technologies and some examples of their use. And I hope to convince you that the Air Force of tomorrow will be a major force of the 21st century. We expect information to be generated by large arrays of sensors aboard satellites, aircraft, and on the ground. Constellation of distributed satellites, these are satellites which work together viewing the same area of the Earth, can provide resolution comparable to that of antennas first and later optics, which span the entire span of the satellite constellation. It's equivalent to having an antenna which is hundreds of kilometers across with an attendant improvement in resolution. Just to sort of motivate the discussion, let me show you 2 pictures here. You can see the one in the upper left, which was produced by a lens. The one in the lower right was produced by a lens having the same diameter, but with only 10% of the aperture filled. This is the same sort of thing that one gets from the distributed satellites. Okay. Now, one thing that one can do with a system of this sort, particularly if you're receiving radio frequency emissions, is that you can find or detect, locate radio emitters, radar emitters, such as surface-to-air missiles. Here, a couple of SA-6 batteries are shown in Bosnia. If one of these batteries emits for as much as 1 second, we will obtain coordinates that are accurate enough for weapon delivery to an accuracy of 10 meters or perhaps better. And if the sites are considered hostile, if there are platforms carrying weapons in the area, we can deliver a hypersonic missile from as far away as 200 miles to strike that site in about 1 minute. In fact, we can make the operation of SAM sites the world's most dangerous occupation. We can take similar action against theater missile launchers. Of course, the emissions are lower and the kill probability will be lower. And we will eventually be able to target directed energy weapons from aircraft and from space almost instantaneously. Sensors aboard air-breathing platforms will be able to locate targets to 1 centimeter accuracy, less than ½ an inch, and target munitions to similar accuracies. You may ask why we need such a capability, mainly for operations in areas where no damage outside the target can be permitted. All the information systems will be tied to operational people and platforms through a dynamic planning and execution control system which controls both attack operations and airlift operations. We must combine the attack functions and logistics functions. They're just 2 parts of the same problem, and during peacetime we can use the same system for directing airlift assets and humanitarian missions. Planning times will be minutes rather than hours and days, and the system will connect systems and people through fiber, satellites, and airborne relay platforms, as shown earlier. Many of the links will be supplied by commercial organizations. Continuously running computer simulations will evaluate current and future plans as they're generated and recommend courses of action to the planners. Airlift will become more effective. We can increase the range and efficiency of airlifters by at least 50%. We can generate improved satellite navigation systems, which are coupled with high-resolution, commercially generated maps, as Dr. Widnall mentioned. And those will allow us to operate in 0-0 conditions. Here I've shown a picture of Tuzla on a good day. It got a lot worse than that and was at the beginning, and you can almost see the runway. This is the view from the ground, and you notice that the end of the runway disappears in the gloom. The Air Force can generate capabilities so that there are no problems in operating under conditions like this, and in fact conditions far worse, conditions where you can't even see the ground from the cockpit of the airplane. Furthermore, it's not even necessary to have material and equipment on the ground to conduct the operations. Part of the problem in Tuzla was in trying to get the approach equipment in so that one could fly approaches even under Category 1, rather benign conditions. Okay. Now, revolutionary airlift capability, which can change the way all operations are conducted, is point-of-use delivery. Another of the problems in Bosnia was the mud, the rain, simply getting from place to place. So there were some methods of point-of-use delivery by air generated. Next slide, please. Here's one of them. It's not very fast, doesn't go very far. Using an airlifter, one can deliver pallets and goods to an accuracy of about 10 meters from 20,000 feet. The efficiencies are nearly endless. Fewer airports, fewer ground bottlenecks, reduced vulnerability to enemy fire are but a few advantages. Now, the 21st century Air Force will project power in new ways. The uninhabited combat air vehicle will bring extreme high performance to the world of aircraft. Now, please note that I use the term uninhabited, not for political correctness. But it's meant to imply that the new aircraft are a major improvement over those we now call unmanned. We call them UCAVs. The UCAV is a child of the information age. Yeah, it's not a result of improvement in aircraft design at this point. It'll be more efficient in the future to bring the pilot to the information than it will be to bring the information to the pilot. Okay. Higher G maneuvers, up to 10 or 20 Gs, positive and negative, will be possible, which means that the aircraft will simply outfly most surface-to-air and air-to-air missiles. It will carry precision sensors to reduce the number of precision sensors that one is expending on board weapons. And different designs, more innovative designs to improve stealth characteristics will also be possible. They will eventually deliver directed energy, high-precision, hypersonic weapons. And we believe that performance will be available at reduced cost in uninhabited vehicles. I know it looks like an F-117, but it's not. Many of the principles of the UCAV will also apply to reconnaissance vehicles, or the URAVs as we have called them. The long dwell, high survivability, coupled with improved performance, will become possible. Now, the stable of weapons will contain information systems that will strike against information systems owned by the enemy. The proliferation of commercial systems that will be available to an enemy will make information munitions to negate those systems essential for our forces. And we believe that information warfare will be an integral part of the 21st century operation. Space operations will affect every operation. We must reduce the cost of using space. Commercial organizations may teach us how to do that, at least in communications and, surprising to some, in surveillance. It's perhaps no surprise to those who read the Wall Street Journal. In some areas, however, the military will still lead the way. Operations will require higher precision of position and time than those that now exist. Higher survivability. And you must remember that in many of these operations, survivability is the key to effective operations. We need survivability of our navigation and timing systems and signals. We need to begin development of a new global positioning system which will have spatial resolution for high dynamic vehicles of about a foot, 30 centimeters, and a timing accuracy of about 1 nanosecond, which is the time required for light to travel a foot. The existing GPS has shown us the phenomenal capabilities which derive from satellite navigation, and we should continue the development of the method to produce even more spectacular results for both the civil and the military communities. I believe the military will continue to lead the way in this area. And we believe that more automation will happen. Within the technology chain, however, there will still be people who must make the life and death decisions. Technology can help those people interact with the machines. We must develop ways of making the human-machine interaction more efficient than it is today. The keyboard and the mouse are simply not adequate for the 21st century. Machines can also teach combat operations and flying. Drugs can enhance performance in some cases for short periods of time. But in the end, it's going to be education and training that matter. Through education and training, the Air Force will continue its tradition as the most technical of the services. Now, I hope I've given you a feeling for the way that New World Vistas will define the Air Force of the future. I've painted a picture at very low resolution, but it shows an Air Force which is much different from the Air Force of today. We believe it to be more capable, less expensive, and we believe it will protect the United States against the enemies of the future. Thank you. We have a short video clip at this point, and then if any of you have questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Fingertips. Today's premier Air Force does more than fly and fight better. It knows its opponent's capabilities and how it plans to use them. And it depends on having superior technology in reserve. With such capability, that Air Force should be able to shut its enemies down, ideally without firing a shot. Although shots were fired, the core of such technologies appeared in the Persian Gulf War, Desert Storm. So-called smart bombs were delivered to very specific targets. Some navigated to the targets themselves. Communications and computer networks were disrupted. Satellites pinpointed the enemy's movements and equipment. Airborne observation posts guided planes to their targets, and there were fighters that were practically invisible to radar. In the Armstrong Laboratories at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, this F-15 pilot may have taken a step into the future when he agreed to try to steer a jet simulator with the electrical impulses of his brain. With some coaching from research engineers and a little practice, he was flying the simulator through hoops on that gigantic screen in about 15 minutes. This woman is balancing a simulator with signals from her brain. Trying to line up or separate the bars on this gauge, she increases a specific part of her brain wave to roll in one direction, decreases it to go the other. Still in its infancy, the research holds promise for future aviators since theoretically it could allow pilots who already have their hands full to give the airplane's computer even more instructions, such as which weapons to select. The challenge is to learn which part of the brain wave does what, and to build a processor that can read it even when the pilot is under stress. It's a tall order, and any useful results may be a long way down the road, but
I think that we actually have nearer-term applications for a lot of this technology for people with disabilities or various kinds of handicaps than we will see in the military environment. Because we can right now use this to turn a light switch on and off, to move a cursor up and down on a computer, simple things like that. And for some of those kinds of things, if you make an error, if it takes a little bit longer to do it, it's not a problem. To really put it in a cockpit and have it finely tuned and honed and resistant to noise and stress, that's a bigger job. We think we can do that as well, But I think the near-term application for this will be for the disabled.
Here's something else, a full-body laser. As the 4 laser heads scan down the subject's body, they read every nook and cranny, feeding back an explicit image that can then be used to make form-fitting flight suits, helmets, or other equipment. This scanner measures the head and face so intimately that technicians could tailor an oxygen mask that would never leak, or a helmet that would fit like skin. Medical scientists already see other humanitarian applications, such as this plastic mask. Working with patients who have severe facial burns, researchers have wanted to make a plastic mask that would protect and at the same time guide healing skin back to its natural contour. Casting it would be painful, but on the other hand, a patient would never feel the laser's inquiring stroke, and every last line would be recorded.
Anyone have questions?
Dr. Paul, I'd like to ask, how fast?
Well,
Among these technologies listed, and Dr. Widnall lists them here, which will be developing more quickly? Are there any of these right on the cusp? Or we looking at midway in the next century? Or?
Could you stand beside the microphone?
Yeah, maybe if you take 3 or 4 of them, the most prominent ones.
Okay, let me say one word about the philosophy that we used. We tried to look at technologies in 10-year blocks, things that were at the demonstration phase now that we thought could be in the force in 10 years, things that were emerging from universities and research laboratories that were probably 20 years away, and then things that were sort of the gleam in the eye that were probably 30 years away. The entry of the first directed energy weapons into the force will be in about 10 years. The airborne laser, for example, as many of you know, is already a project the Air Force is working on. The integration of those systems into fighter aircraft is at least 20 years away, and moving those weapons into space to have them actually direct energy from space is a 20 to 30 year project. The uninhabited combat vehicles could be tested and actually developed to the demonstration phase in about a decade and enter the force in about 20 years. That meshes rather nicely, actually, with programs like the F-22 and JAST, in that you may even find that the end of the production of JAST is an uninhabited vehicle, and they'll start coming into the force sort of 20-year time frame. The reconnaissance vehicles, as you know, are available today, and they will continue to improve over the next decade. The information systems, such as the distributed satellites, could be available first in about a decade, perhaps not as a worldwide system, but as constellations that survey large parts of the world. What we tried to do there was to find ways of reducing the cost so we could build a lot of satellites to get more capability. The commercial world is now trying to build satellites from design to flight in about 2 years. So I hope that the military can learn from that and start to get the distributed systems and the information systems in during the next 1 to 2 decades. But let me just say one other thing about the way that one has to build these systems in the future. I sometimes describe the government procurement of the internet by saying that, well, if I want to build an internet, what I'll do is I'll go out and I'll find 4 million people who want this thing, and I'll sign them all up, and then I'll find an equipment manufacturer who's going to turn out one kind of computer and one piece of software, and then in about a decade we're going to say, okay, the internet's ready, guys, turns on Thursday. And that's not the way it happens, and it's not the way that military systems are going to happen in the future. We're going to start building things in 1s and 2s and 3s, putting them together in integrated systems, learning about them, and then evolving them from there.
I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned a connection between precision-guided munitions and delivery of supplies, airlift and so forth. How would that work? What's that?
The delivery of supplies will be based on the GPS system. The precision-guided munitions will also be based on that system. if you deliver things, whether it's a cargo or weapon, by coordinates, longitude, latitude to high precision, you wind up with a far less expensive system, and you always know where it's going. I mean, you know, you don't switch from the third house on the right to the one in the next block.
Dropping supplies now?
Dropping supplies. There are some programs that are proceeding in what's called precision airdrop, but they tend to be very expensive because they use very expensive, huge parafoils like the show jumpers use, and that's not going to be the way to go. We're going to go with the old-fashioned looking system, but with enough guidance to make it accurate. It also means you need to measure the wind and correct for the wind because you don't have a lot of guidance authority on a system like that.
Will this replace the standard approach then, you think, or just be a supplement?
It will replace the standard approach to airdrop, whatever that is. It was a system that was developed in World War II and has improved little since then. And it's pretty much a hit or miss thing. It's really considered an emergency operation. No one wants to do it routinely, although we've done a lot of it in Bosnia.
What's the greatest challenge that you face in New World Vistas?
I think do you mean technical or in actually getting it done? All right, let me say a word about getting it done first. As you know, corporations, the government, the Air Force, all tend to be aligned along department lines. And so, and you pretty much have to have that because if everyone were a generalist, you'd never get anything built. So you have to have people who are focusing on the problem. But as we've shown here, the advantage is going to come to integration and combining of things in the future. And it's very difficult to get people to think that, well, maybe I don't want to build my system at maximum efficiency because if I build it at lower efficiency, I can interact with this other system, and together we'll have something that's better than either of us would have. That's very difficult. In terms of the technologies, I think that the communication systems are in hand. Or will be shortly. They're in hand in the laboratories at least, as are the sort of the ideas for going into space with distributed satellites. The actual development of airplanes that can fly at 20 Gs is not going to be trivial. That's going to be really a significant development. The development of hypersonic missiles so that we can attack these targets that are just there for a short time. Somebody who rushes out of a cave and starts shooting at you, or someone who sets up a missile launcher beside the highway and starts launching missiles, and you really need to get at them in just a few minutes. And so the hypersonic vehicle, though, is going to be really a challenge. I think we can do it.
To what extent should a defense contractor take your summary volume and use it as a blueprint against which to focus and bankroll future independent research and development efforts?
I think we would be very flattered if that happened. I would be a little surprised if a study mounted by a defense contractor would come to much different conclusions. I think the uncertainty would be in whether the Air Force is going to follow these suggestions or not, and the response has really been very rewarding.
What impact will, in the POM process, will this start showing, funding start showing up in 97 or 98, 99, from what you've seen?
The funding is already being programmed from the 98 POM.
How much?
You have to realize that I don't get into the budgets in detail very much, but it will correspond to about 15% of the S&T investment for the Air Force, plus another investment at the basic research level. I think that'll come to what, $200 million a year or something like that, and then another investment at about the $20 million a year in very basic research, university or laboratory sort of research. The Air Force seems to be stepping up to do this. There's a section in the report that says what to stop, and you can imagine that caused a certain amount of grief, and will continue to be discussed. If the report is not at least debatable, You know, if everyone agrees and there's no discussion, then we haven't done our job. I mean, we really need to get ideas out that people can talk about and start moving on, and I hope that's what we've done. Yes.
One of the 5 technology areas that you mentioned that being critical, but you only have one line of explanation, was the next generation stealth, or the next plateau of stealth.
Okay.
Can you go?
Sure. The uninhabited vehicle will improve the use of stealth as we know it, what I call passive stealth. For example, if you wanted to build an airplane that were perfectly smooth on the bottom, had some particular shape, you could do that. And when you're ready to land it, you simply roll it over and the wheels come out of the top of the airplane and all of the things are put up top. That's possible. It's a little difficult with the pilot. The pilots don't like that sort of thing. But there's no reason you can't do it with these. But eventually, and also you can use rather odd shapes because you don't have a cockpit or injection seat or things like that. But eventually, I think you reach the limit of that. And probably that limit is about another factor of 10 in radar cross-section below where we are. Sort of another factor of 2 in radar range from the defender's point of view. And at that point, we have to start making the airplane truly invisible, which means we have to simply repeat and reverse the signals that are striking the airplane so that it disappears entirely. And also the infrared signals continue to be a problem, and we need to address those as well.
Is there a cost for this report? How much did it cost to put this report out?
Oh, the entire study, as near as I can tell, including all the travel, all the meetings, everything, was around $500,000. You have to realize that the SAB members mostly don't get paid. All of us are volunteers. It's been said that running the SAB is like herding cats because there are all these volunteers and you try to get places of people, and everyone just cooperates marvelously. We could not have paid. We could not have gotten the same group of people together to do this job had we been paying them real consultant salaries.
I'm not sure I followed the statement you made about it'll be more efficient to bring the pilot to the information rather than the information to the pilot.
Yes, there are several things that are happening. First, envision the fighter cockpit, which isn't going to change because it's related to aerodynamics and the performance of airplanes. So we wind up with a number of 6-inch flat panel displays presented to a guy who's flying the airplane and trying to stay alive and shooting missiles, and people are shooting at him. And so we have these endless discussions about let's don't overload the pilot. What does the pilot need? What should we send them? But the communication systems are getting a lot better. With fibers, you can imagine sending all of the telephone conversations in the United States from a decade ago over one fiber now. Also, the compression systems for data are getting a lot better. And then there's a third point, and that is that a lot of the information, most of the information, will not be collected by the airplane that needs to have the information. It's collected other places, satellites, ground sensors, other airplanes. Even for the F-22, the pilot's display shows information from the pilot's wingman. All right, so eventually you begin to overload the pilot, and you're better off having the pilot in Missouri with the number of assistants working an 8-hour day, sleeping at home, and commercial technicians to repair the equipment, to work on normal schedules, instead of having them out in the theater flying missions. It's just going to be more effective that way.
Well, is there a danger here of sort of technological overload, where the technology becomes so complex and interlinked, and so that it becomes beyond the capacity for humans to deal with it?
There's certainly that possibility, and that is the possibility that the technologist has to guard against forever. Because we all like these wonderful things that operate on their own and perform these marvelous tasks. But what we have to make sure of is that the people are the primary actors at the important points. I mean, that the people make the decisions and that the machines make the recommendations. And I think there's another thread that runs through the report, and that is that education and training are going to be at a premium in the Air Force. But yes, you're right, and And everywhere along the way, you have to worry about overloading people or about things happening they don't understand.
Is it your estimate that there's going to be enough money in projected Air Force budgets to afford this?
I think so. You know, the way I see new things like this being done is that we sort of imposed upon ourselves another condition, and that is that it's very nice to tell the Air Force what they ought to be doing in a decade, and someone will say, hey, that's wonderful, therefore in 9 years, 364 days, I'm going to start working this problem, and I'll be ready in a decade. You know it doesn't work that way. So what we tried to do is to say, what does the Air Force do tomorrow? In fact, we call it that. We say, what do we do tomorrow to get there in 10 years or 20 years? And the Air Force seems to be stepping up to it. I don't think it's any more expensive. I think it's less expensive than what we're doing today because it's fewer people and because it's fewer total systems.
How about non-lethal weapons?
Yes.
Could you give us a couple?
We looked at a number of non-lethal, or what I call sub-lethal or less than lethal systems, realizing that any of those non-lethal systems will kill you under certain conditions, whether it's sticky foam or whatever. We looked at a few such as microwaves and lasers. Microwaves really seem to be the future because one can attack systems. You can attack information systems. You can attack weapon delivery systems, and it appears that might be the future in that area. The others tend to be more specialized in their use. You can't use sticky foam in the Arctic; it freezes. You have problems with certain chemicals if it's raining, and but you develop a way of using it. And you might say that a non-lethal system that we really support is information warfare.
Could you explain to the ground watch the difference between microwaves, just very briefly, and lasers, and why microwaves, say, would not hurt you or might not kill you?
Well, we were looking at it from the point of view of attacking electrical systems with microwaves. And the reason that they tend to be effective is because they drive electrical currents in these systems, large electrical currents. So you can produce currents that will burn out transistors and do rather strange things to electronics. And we think that will be possible in the future. You could imagine, for example, in the future that if you're attacked by an airplane, you could simply turn on all the warning lights in that airplane, which would send them home or cause them to bail out.
To follow up on Charlie's question, if you're using microwaves to attack equipment and there are people in the vicinity, what happens to the people?
Another feature of the microwaves is that they can be focused very well. That they're not optical frequencies, but they're high enough frequencies and short enough wavelengths that antennas can direct them. And so you really have to use them in situations where you don't hurt the people, although equipment tends to be a lot more susceptible than people.
How do you make right now rules of engagement often dictate that you can't even use beyond visual range weapons when you have a manned aircraft? Then how do you make the leap to using weapons from unmanned aircraft?
Yeah, the reason for that rule is that we have not been able to identify the enemy real well sometimes. Although many times we've gone overboard in imposing that kind of rule. Part of the reason for these technologies is so we make that identification much, much better. So we have wide spectral ranges. So we have RF and visible and infrared viewing. And we believe that we can sort that out well enough by using very accurate location systems so that we won't have to have visual identification.
How soon do you think that barrier will fall? A decade?
I think it'll be not earlier than a decade, yes. Probably after 10 and up to maybe 20 years.
Unfortunately, because of the follow-on briefing, you only have time for one more question.
Sir, just two real quick questions. What does this mean for the Air Force's long-range manpower requirements? Will it mean a drop in personnel levels? And the second thing is, has there been any resistance from an Air Force that is very pilot-oriented? Most of the Air Force leaders are fighter pilots. This essentially sounds like it's going to put them out of a job over the next 20 to 30 years.
I would, well, let me address the first part first. That is that we believe that the manpower levels in the Air Force will go down, whatever happens. So what we're trying to do is to come up with ideas which will allow the Air Force to operate under those conditions. As the force goes down, it will be necessary to have the force more highly trained and better educated. Now, for the second part of the question about pilots, the answer is no, there's no resistance. A few years ago, there was much resistance. But I think, for one thing, by the turn of the century, approximately 19% of Air Force officers will be pilots, or maybe it's even less. And I think the pilots are beginning to realize that there are certain jobs that they can do. I don't think we're ever going to replace a manned airplane. I think we're going to need a human brain out there in many of these cases. But I think we're going to have fewer of them. And I think the pilots realize that they can be helped by these uninhabited vehicles just as much as they can be helped by a hypersonic weapon. So I think the acceptance, starting perhaps a year or two ago, has really been, it surprised me, actually. I think that's probably your real question. Yes, I'm surprised, but I'm pleased by the way they're accepting the ideas.
Will these 20 backup volumes be on the internet through Air Force Link? If you wanted to browse through
yes, they will be eventually. Yes, yes. They're off at the printers for the most part now, and as you note, there is a CD-ROM that comes with the report. They'll all be on CD-ROM, and we hope to have them on the Air Force Net. So,
Dr. McCall will be available today if anybody wants to do any follow-on interviews. If you need more copies of the videotape or the report or anything, you can just call Gloria Kales at the Air Force Press Desk at 695-0640.
Prints of the projection, for example, that you